Hi there, I'm Chief Scott Fraser with the Brockville Police, and we're here today with Sonya Jodoin from Victim Services discussing a very important topic, and it's in the news every day now, and specifically human trafficking. And a lot of people, when they think of human trafficking, will think that it's somebody trying to smuggle another person into the United States or from the United States into Mexico. But what we're here talking about is the other form of human trafficking, which is generally the exploitation of people for a sexual purpose.
Yeah, so the vast majority of human trafficking that happens in Canada is sexual exploitation. And what we know at this point in time is that over 90% are girls, that it starts at quite a young age, 13, although we know of cases where kids have been recruited as young as 11, and that they're Canadian girls within Canada. So what's happening is that they're recruiting kids, and they're not transporting them all over the country and all over the world and all over the things like that. They're recruiting them here in Canada and Ontario. The vast majority of human trafficking victims actually come from Ontario.
And that's kind of different than when it used to be years ago, where people were promised jobs like, you'd be a nanny or a housekeeper, and you'd come from a foreign country to Canada, and then the next thing you're involved in the sex trade.
Yeah.
And it's evolved because obviously that would be very expensive, time consuming, and now criminals have found a shorter way to try and recruit people locally.
Yeah, and that still happens. I know of two people who were trafficked internationally from different countries, obviously, and brought into Canada, and it still exists. And labor trafficking still exists as well too, as other forms of trafficking. But what we see here in Canada, though, the primary is young girls, and they're trafficked in Canada, and sometimes they're moved around from province to province, and sometimes they're just moved around up and down the 401, where we happen to reside.
And it's there's no specific cookie cutter printout of what a victim might look like.
No, you'll see, I think the average age is around between 15 and 21-ish, 23, somewhere in that range. But like I said, the recruitment can start as young as 11. And teenagers are really the prime, they're vulnerable to begin with, but there's also a whole set of what's called vulnerability factors and then systemic barriers. And when you put them together, there's a whole group of kids that get recruited into human trafficking, and very easily. And it's happening right underneath our noses. We know of cases where traffickers have been going to high schools. We know of cases where they've been giving phones to girls that they're recruiting and grooming, and that are in the high schools, and that's how we're catching. We know they go to group homes. We know of cases where they've been recruiting out of group homes, and there's one group home in Ontario recently that was shut down as a result of the volume of human trafficking that was happening, and not very far away from here. So it's really not. I think people have this image, of this foreign girl, whatever, from wherever, speaking a foreign language. And like I said, I know of one particular case even, it does happen.
Yes.
But what we really need to be concerned about are the teenagers in particular that are being recruited, and they're being dragged out of rural areas like ours, isolated, maybe economic challenges, all of those things, and they're prime for being recruited, and then they're being worked all over the place in Ontario against their will. And
I think that's the message to drive home here too, is the fact that we all may have an idea of who this victim is, and a drug dealer from a foreign country. That's not the case. It could be your neighbor, it could be your own child, it could be someone at the school, and that's why we're trying to bring the education to people. So, in particular, friends. If you're best friends with somebody and you start seeing things, the important thing is for you to tell someone, because all too often nobody's reporting, nobody's telling.
That's right.
And that's how it gets. That's how it happens in our kind of particular area. Yeah. And so we've been reaching out to schools. I know there's been a lot of media, and there's lots of programs everybody's working on. And I think it's really getting the message out to the public that's so important. And what does a typical offender look like? How do we say, here's what, if you see this offender, here's what?
Well, actually, and a lot of times, recruiters and offenders will fit in really, really well with society, especially with the adults. So they look like respectable members of society. They look like they belong. They communicate well. They're not, there's a certain percentage that maybe is that recruitment, human trafficking is related to drugs and to gangs. But then there's at least, I think it's probably around 50% of it that's not. And so you have recruiters that do not picture the image that everybody thinks that they picture. So it might just look like a nice young person, male or female, that is, hanging out with your kid, and you may not know actually what else is going on underneath it all. And the kids that are being recruited, they're not necessarily, the homeless kids, although those kids are prime. They're kids who, for whatever reasons, maybe they're having some challenges in school. Maybe their, home life's been a little unsteady lately. Like maybe they're feeling a little vulnerable. Maybe they're lacking self-confidence. Maybe they're lacking some kind of connection to their community or their families. That describes the vast majority of teenagers you're ever going to meet right there. And those are all vulnerabilities that allow them to be recruited into human trafficking. Mm-hmm. So it happens, we know of cases where they've come from families that are, upper middle class, well-to-do, well-off, like it happens to everybody. And it's not this underbelly of, the only people that it's happening to and the only people involved are these people that are skulking around, in the back alleys all the time. It's actually just right under our noses.
And that's what's so hard from the policing perspective for us, is we can't give the public, here's a cookie cutter offender, here's a cookie cutter victim. If you see this and this together, call 911. And therefore it becomes very difficult. And that's why we're continually telling people, if you see something suspicious, call us. And, I can go back to a couple of events that have occurred in our community, because we're along the 401 and a vehicle stops, two males, well-dressed, a very nice car, and a female gets out of the back seat, takes off running. The males run after her, catch her, put her back in the car. Those people got away. Unfortunately, they were captured on video from a closed-circuit camera that assisted us, but that would be a typical scenario you might see. And we would hope if people saw that, you call 911, because obviously that's troubling. Yeah. And we can't guarantee that was related to human trafficking, but it certainly fit all the tolls, and there wasn't enough evidence to ever find the vehicle or the people because the camera angles just didn't work for us. So those things are happening, and that's in Brockville.
That's in Brockville, yep.
And I guess there is kind of, not necessarily patterns, but for hotel staff, what would they look for?
So the hotel staff, typically what you would find is somebody who won't, the traffic person, typically everything is controlled for them. So their ID is being held, and they don't handle any money. They don't speak when they're spoken to, typically, unless they have permission to, because they're not, typically the trafficker will speak for them. Sometimes you'll see, a young female with an older male, and it doesn't, she may not be dressed appropriate for the weather. So her clothing may be quite sparse maybe, but not, not to the point that everybody's gonna become obvious as to why she's there, what she might be doing. And typically the traffickers handle all of the business deals. And then if they see that there's a lot of activity that's going along that's suspicious, the traffic victim is never really in an opportunity to kind of say to somebody, hey, I need help. Mm-hmm. They're not left alone, unsupervised. Often they don't know where they are. If you ask a trafficking victim, let's say you did grab somebody on a traffic stop and you say, where do you live? They may not be able to tell their current address because they may not know where they live. They may not know where they are. They may not know what town they're in. Mm-hmm. And so there's a real lack of information that this person's going to have because everything is censored and controlled. So.
Yep. And I think even for some of the victims who were successful in getting away, that was one of their biggest things, because people always say, if an opportunity gets up, you just run away. Yeah, well, but they're so afraid.
There's a lot more to it than that, So part of what happens with human trafficking, there's a huge grooming process. So human trafficking is big dollars. So a teenager can earn a human trafficker about $1,000 a day, and that's on the low estimate. So $360,000 a year for a teenage mm-hmm. girl. That's one girl, and there's usually more than one person that they're trafficking. And so they're willing to invest time to groom this person. And the grooming process is really to set up the type of relationship and the type of situation where a trafficker's not going to run away, where they're not going to even self-identify as to what's happening to them. And they'll spend months. They'll spend months grooming because this is an investment. There's actually a whole business model on human trafficking. You can actually, that teaches traffickers how to do all of this, how often they should beat their trafficking victims, how often they should feed them, which is typically maybe once a day, how many hours sleep, about 4 hours sleep a night. It gives a whole model on what to do to manipulate, to control, to create a type of bond with the trafficking victim that is a psychological bond, it's an emotional bond, and it's based on abuse. And it makes it very hard then for the victim to break that, to just run away. A, they don't recognize what's happening. B, they don't have, by that point in their life, they don't really have anywhere to go in a lot of cases because they've been so isolated from their family, their friends, they've been cut off, they don't have any money, they don't have any resources, they don't have any ID, and they're usually struggling with a lot of trauma as well from their experiences, so it's not that simple.
Mm-hmm. And I guess the sad thing about it, it's not just big cities. It's not just Montreal and Toronto and Calgary and Vancouver.
Yeah.
This is happening.
This is happening everywhere. And, there's like, we can see lots of times evidence of, like we said, the 401 puts us in a particular position where people are traveled from one city, major city, to an next. So the 401, the 416. And you can see how a human trafficking victim will be brought up and down the highway. This is happening every day. There's people getting, in the hotels and in places or houses that are being used or rented or whatever the case might be that are trafficked. There's business obviously for it here in Brockville because they keep stopping in Brockville.
Yeah.
So, and I think the impression that people have is kind of like if somebody, and a trafficking victim will work to give this impression because their life depends on it. And that, they're willingly doing this work and they enjoy this work and that is paid sex work. But unless you are intimately familiar with this person's structure and setup and relationship, you're going to have no way of knowing whether or not they're trafficked or they're working independently as a sex worker. Majority of the time, you're going to be meeting people who have been trafficked. But I think people believe, like they believe that, well, if you're choosing to be a sex worker, that's your choice, or whatever the case might be. And lots of times it really hasn't been a choice.
That's right. And getting the word out there is often made a lot easier with the internet. Backpage.com and other various sites where people who know what they're looking for know where to go to find it. Yep.
And then you see folks being driven through town. There's folks that, are, Brockville's not a hot spot in the sense that there's a hub community of all kinds of stuff happening, but it is still happening here. It's happening because of the stops from the highway. It's happening because of the recruitment. And really for our environment, we should be particularly focused on recruitment with the teenagers and the rural environments and the frustration with lack of jobs or lack of opportunities and how easy it is for them to get scooped off and taken out of the community. So.
And I think increasingly now as we look at social media and teenagers who are on their phone almost all the time, it's so important as a parent to ask those tough questions or to look at, try and have passwords so you can get on and see what type of conversations. It's very difficult and technology makes it difficult. But, as a parent or a friend or whatever, it's really important to try and keep your eye on this. And if you have some understanding, at least you can start looking for some cues, which may not just jump right out at you right away.
They're not going to. And because it's a gradual process, like the grooming process isn't like you meet somebody one day and then 3 days later you're a human trafficking victim. And because there's a whole method and process to it, it's not necessarily easily recognizable right off the bat because sometimes the warning signs are small, and they build over time.
Yeah.
And so what ends up happening lots of the time is somebody can start out with what you might see on social media might seem to be relatively normal. Like, how many teenagers do you know have like 100, 200, 300, whatever friends on Facebook?
Mm-hmm.
So and then they get, a friend request. It's a friend of a friend. Yes.
Yep.
They
Yep.
say yes, right?
Yep.
Like, and then next thing you know, but then next thing you know, this person what they're doing is they're gathering information. So the first, they recognize, they cruise around online and they look for a few key things, things that point out to them right away that this person might be vulnerable and might be able to be recruited. So they gather information. It's super easy to get information on somebody from Facebook and other social media sites, Instagram, Snapchat, whatever, and they get the information, and then they target the vulnerable areas. So once somebody knows what your vulnerability is, they target to fill that vulnerability.
Mm-hmm.
So if somebody's lonely, then suddenly you've got a friend. If somebody is feeling underappreciated, then suddenly you have somebody who appreciates you more than anything else in the whole wide world. Mm-hmm. So it's really planned. It's really well thought out, and because of the amount of time they're willing to invest in it, going for weeks or months of kind of getting this person to the point where they're not going to be able to escape from it. They feel like they're trapped and they're stuck, and that they owe the trafficker, and that they can't leave that easily.
And that's the whole point, where traffickers have been working and honing their skills.
Yeah.
And that they're really going after, it's like hunting prey.
Yeah.
And the teenager that they're identifying.
Yeah.
And that's what makes it so difficult. Because if this was a simple investigation, we wouldn't be here talking to you today about it, because it would all be solved. So as far as the public, if they see something suspicious, we're always saying, call the police. People are often worried. I don't want to call 911. I don't want to bother anybody. Well, I keep telling people that's what our officers are here for. When that call comes in, that they can get out, and timely response is the key, in particular in this case. If you saw someone who appears to be taken and they're not willingly going, that's something that's time sensitive. You need to get a hold of us, and we have to get there immediately, because once that opportunity for 5 minutes, in 5 minutes you can be from Parkdale and North Augusta Road on the 401 and be a long way up the 401 east or west in 5 minutes.
Wonderful.
So what would be, if we could come out with a list, what would be some of the things that a person could look for where they may recognize a person's being trafficked?
Well, I think some of the things that you would potentially look for are signs that a person's anxious and fearful, and very hypervigilant and intimidated, and they avoid eye contact. Like, I think there was a article in the American news about a stewardess who recognized that a girl was being flown across, but she was a traffic victim because the young girl wouldn't make eye contact with her, wouldn't talk to her, and the much older male kept answering for her. So she found a way to communicate directly with that girl and ask her if she needed help, and she did, and she actually rescued her. And so that was a really key sign. What I think our image of human trafficking too is that, as soon as it's like they meet the person, 3 days later they're scooped up and whisked off, but that's not necessarily the case.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes kids can still be in school, or they might even still be living at home or wherever it is that they're living, and and the trafficking has started, and they're being trafficked at this point in time, or being sold or exploited. You might see a real drop in grades. You will see a lot of isolation and from family or friends or any kind of groups that they might be involved in. You might see a lot of gaps in their memory. A sudden, there might be signs of substance abuse or self-harm behaviors, or physical injuries, like minor physical injuries with some. There is as common for traffickers to tattoo a brand on their trafficking victims, because that's how it gives a sign to other traffickers that this person is owned and belongs to this trafficker, and that's how they recognize who's who. They'll have no personal possessions or money oftentimes with them. And I talked about the fact that they'll be unsure of their address oftentimes, or where they're going. And lots of times after a point in time, you're going to see some poor health and some, because, if you're not sleeping because you're working and you're not eating because you're controlled with how much and how often you can eat, eventually catches up to you. A lot of distrust for authority, and because lots of times as part of the process to get people into the human trafficking as victims is there's a lot of conditioning in terms of making sure that they don't trust authority, and sometimes their life or what they've been threatened with depends on their fighting back. So sometimes what you might find is you may end up with a human trafficking victim that's brought into the hospital because they've been hurt for whatever reason, whether it be, from their trafficker or maybe somebody that they were being exploited to, and they will be very antagonistic with anybody in authority because they've been warned and warned and warned, and they've seen evidence, and people have been hurt over making sure that they demonstrate that they are not going to participate with police in any way, shape, or form, and that they turn the police away from looking at them or paying attention to them. And so you'll often have a trafficking victim who's very aggressive with a police officer, who's, speaks aggressively, might, lash out here or there, and it's because they're essentially trying to save their life or the life of their pet or the well-being of somebody that they do care about that has been threatened and is being used as being held against them as a way to get them to cooperate.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I'll tell you, it's certainly there's a lot there, and it could be one or two or three.
Yeah.
It might be all of them, and it might only be one. So it's certainly some good tools for people to at least keep an eye out for. And as we always said, people can go on the internet. There's information about this on the internet.
There is a ton of information out there. There are different groups throughout the province that are working quite diligently to spread public awareness and information and resources about human trafficking. Anybody in our area is always welcome to contact one of us at Victim Services via email or call our main office line, which is 1-800-939-7682, or at any point touch base with us, and we will help to provide information, resources, or connect them to wherever it is they need to be.
Well, that's great, and like we've said previously too, if you see something, report it, and you'll hear that throughout all different types of kind of scenarios that take place. But if you see it, you think it's suspicious, report it.